Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Hybrid Healing Hour. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Huma Ali, and we are going to be talking about environmental toxins. So, Huma, please tell everybody a little bit about your background and what got you involved with environmental medicine.
Sure. So I grew up in Pakistan. My parents were immigrants from India, so me and Brian share that background. It's special to us. And so I'm a physician. I'm a family physician. I've been here in Boca Raton for 2 decades now. 2003 is exactly when I started here. But it's interesting because growing up, I was never into medicine. I wasn't into like course books. I would read everything else except my school books. So I thought like I would just study literature that would allow me to just read widely. And my dad made this deal with me. He thought that I could do something with my brain. So he said, why don't you try to get into medical school? If you didn't in the first attempt, if you didn't get in, you would just study whatever you want or not study. So I tried, I gave it my best, and I earned a merit scholarship to go into medical school. And then my dad was like, you want to now take literature? You go ahead. And I think it was like a deal, or he knew already, but that was like very hard to give up. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go. I got a scholarship, like a whole free ride. So I did it, and then still I couldn't get too much into this medical books. They were very dry and not that interesting. Then I got here like at 23, right after graduation. I just got here to the U.S., did the residency, really enjoyed it. And then, when we all start in private practice, you're like, we're going to change the world now. What happened to me is, Brian knows my practice, Associated Family Physicians. It was a great practice, great people. I still work very closely with them. But my patients were great, but I had this dissatisfaction. I felt that people are coming to me not to get a prescription, but they want to know what is going on in their bodies, what's giving them the symptoms. And the only tools I had was my prescription pad. So it's like, come in and within 5 minutes, if I'm not writing a prescription, what am I even doing? And then you have to just walk them out. And that leads you to this heaviness, this dissatisfaction that every night you're going to bed and you're like, what did I do? I felt like I didn't get to the root cause. Like I didn't really go deep enough, and I don't even know how. So when they offered me partnership, they were so nice. They were like, you need to do a soul searching and see, is this for you? Do you want to become our partner? And I said no. And I do my soul searching. This model is not, for me. And I felt the conventional model in which we were trained is more suitable for acute care or for hospital care, because there you can give one answer. You come with pneumonia, I write a prescription for antibiotics, you get better. So I then, at that time, Brian knows I was going through some personal crises, and this professionally, I was not satisfied. Which actually, Brian, I don't know if you know that people are studying this phenomenon of burnout now. I have a mentor, Lara Salyer. All she does is study burnout, and they're doing scans like functional MRIs, and they're finding that 50% of healthcare providers are showing this pattern of grief on their imaging, like MRIs. It's like we are grieving for something that we wanted to do, but in this current system, we're not able to do. So I think there are a lot of reasons for burnout, but that was my biggest one. So I was really successful in my hospital practice. Thanks to support from people like you, like Brian was one of the pioneers. He started supporting me. He said, I will trust you with my patients in the hospital, which I hold so close to my heart, because my relationship with your practice and you, Brian, has been so clean and authentic. It's like we are there to care for patients. So I did really enjoy that for almost 2 decades. But now with the current situation with the pandemic, and after a while you start questioning that what is happening in the hospital environment is we are seeing younger and younger patients coming with more and more severe disease. Like, whoever thought in our residency or training or med school, we never thought we would see 20 and 30-year-olds, not one, with 2 autoimmune diseases. 30 and 40-year-olds are walking into the hospital with cancer that has metastasized everywhere. So it leads you to think, what is going on? What are we doing? And that led me to this path of where I started studying root cause. In my second practice that I've created, I take pride in using a personalized approach towards longevity and root cause analysis. So if someone comes with a symptom, we really, instead of writing a prescription, go to what is happening, what are the processes that are happening behind this symptom. And that led me to be interested in environmental toxins, because what we are seeing is environmental toxins are at the root cause for almost all major illnesses, and more importantly, cancer and autoimmune disease.
And I think that is a wonderful description of how we feel as well about the passion we have for medicine. It's not about just prescribing people medication. We always want to think about the root cause, and that's why we're so excited to have you on today. So why don't you tell our audience and our listeners, why should everybody care about this?
Yeah, it gives me a little bit of chills every time I talk about it. Like I said, what we are seeing is younger and younger people getting sicker and sicker. Disease has become so complex that there is not one answer. So I think we owe it to ourselves, to people, to research. So for example, I'll give you an example. I have these two bright and young associates. They're both just turned 30. So they were in their early 20s. And, they're the most intelligent and hardworking, diligent associates I have. They're nurse practitioners. One of them, her high school boyfriend just passed away. She just attended a funeral. And she was pretty shaken. She had to speak at the funeral. And he had some autoimmune disease. He was in the ICU. They couldn't save him. The other one, the high school or college friend that grew up and they lived in the same dorm, just got diagnosed with ALS. And as far as we know, it's a fatal diagnosis. There are some experimental treatments. There's some root cause analysis we can do. So he's moving, leaving everything. His whole family's coming to Miami. So that gives you a pause of what is going on in our environment. And I think it's a missed opportunity for the powers that be, because they're not telling us. And I think we all know there's a lot of money and power at stake as to why we are not being told by the authorities, don't do this, don't eat this, clean, because the whole industries are at stake. But I feel like who are we, that would we continue to poison the people and the planet just to save an industry? That's not me and you stand for. I know, Brian, I know you. So I think it is our responsibility. And also, it's not to scare people, but I think it's so empowering once you know that there are simple things you can do, and that leads you to a more cleaner lifestyle, and you notice a change. So honestly, there are few people that have remarked, lately people see me and they're like, are you reverse aging? You look the same as we saw you 10 years ago. If anything, you look better. And I'm like, I've been on this journey, and there are simple things, and it's not an event, it's not one thing to do, but it's a journey. And when you start on that, every step you take makes you feel healthier, more at peace, cleaner, more empowered. So why wouldn't we,
Absolutely.
So,
there's many types of toxins out there. So why don't we talk about some of the more commonly encountered toxins, things like metals, and so why don't you start with metals? Right.
So we can classify toxins because there are so many that we cannot even name them, or we can't even count them. In the 1900s, they tried to count and they could only count 500. And now there are tens of thousands of them. So then I feel it's better to classify them as either naturally occurring toxins or artificially occurring toxicants. So naturally occurring would be something like mold, byproducts of bacterial, like if we have Clostridia or Candida, they're byproducts or oxalates that we can produce from inside our body. So these both natural toxins can be produced from inside our bodies, or they could be coming from the environment, like algae bloom, you've heard of that. So then there are artificial or man-made toxins, which are just innumerable. This really an alphabet soup. There are tens of thousands of them. So metals would actually be natural, but it's just the way that the environment has changed that they're accumulating in our bodies. But then there are others like pesticides, there are plastics, BPAs, phthalates, parabens. So you name it, and it's like anything right now we touch or breathe or take into our mouth, we should be thinking, what is it that I'm taking in with it?
And I know, like with women, we wear cosmetic, makeup, and if it's not been tested, you don't know what you're putting in on your body, and the skin is the most absorbable surface. So it doesn't have to be ingested. It could be topical as well, and people just don't realize that.
Yeah, skin is the biggest area, so much more than what we eat. So it's unfortunate that most people are not aware that BPA. So most makeup, if it contains BPA, it's a huge hormone disruptor. So I'm glad you mentioned it. That wasn't part of what I was planning on talking about, but now that brings to point this summit that I just attended. And in that it was a PCOS summit. So they were talking about why there's this epidemic of PCOS, younger and younger women. So not women, it's PCOS, men, it's infertility. Like, IVF has become like a household name now. And these BPAs that are found in these cosmetics are at play here. They are endocrine disruptors. So even very small amount can disrupt our hormones, sex hormones. And that's leading to an epidemic of PCOS. And in men, it's infertility. So as scary as it sounds, let me give you the promising part is that they did a study. And they took a group of people, lay people, not highly educated, not professionals. They took these women, and they taught them how to avoid, the BPAs in cosmetics, and they just taught them how to eat healthy and simple things like not, it's interesting, like, the receipts that we all get from the grocery stores, they cannot be produced. They are called thermal receipts, and it's a huge amount of BPA is needed to produce them. And what do we all do now that the COVID has been around? We put this Purell or the hand sanitizer on our hands, and that disrupts the skin barrier. It makes the skin so porous because it disrupts whatever oils or whatever was on there. Then when you touch that receipt, you're absorbing that BPA right in there. So they did simple things like just say no to receipts or provide them with a wallet or something, like drop it in there. Just no plastic. They eliminated all plastics from their kitchens. They were told to use clean products that are BPA free. And what they saw was, within weeks, they saw a huge difference in how much weight they lost, how they felt, how their hormonal balance was.
So what I'm hearing is it is possible to reverse this.
It's
so
very possible.
We can make changes today, which is great. So what are some symptoms? So here we are talking about, you mentioned PCOS, but what are some other symptoms of toxicity? How do people know if they're affected by this?
So one thing is that we may not have symptoms, and they could still be at play. They could still be causing the dysregulation. And I almost feel like once you will see a symptom, it may be too late. Mm-hmm. So I think every one of us should know what our toxic burden is. Because unless we make it obvious, that data is very motivating. I eat pretty clean. Not even before I studied this, I was like a clean eating person. Brian has been to my house. We always cook at home. We don't eat outside. But when I did my own toxic testing, I'm like, I have polystyrene and plastics, all kind of things. Like, where is it coming from? And the doctor that I was working with, she was like, well, do you ever eat from cafeteria? Do you ever use their boxes? And they're putting hot food in there. So when you're putting hot food in polystyrene, guess where it's going? So at that time, I did not have symptoms. But when I did my profile, I was pretty dirty. And since I've made all the changes, now I'm thinking about doing it again to see. But some of the symptoms, I would say you could pretty much think that anyone with any review of systems positive, you should look for them. But more commonly, you would think of brain fog, anxiety, trouble concentrating, this overwhelm that we feel, skin issues, a lot of gut issues, bloating, like IBS, a lot of those.
I think fatigue is one too.
Fatigue is big one.
And I think when people just don't feel optimal, if everything's looking good on your blood work,
right,
and you just don't feel right, I think this is definitely a good go-to method to check and see if there's toxins that are causing a lot of inflammation throughout the body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it made some. So yes, fatigue, acne, dark circles under the eyes, itchy skin, bad breath. That's a very telltale sign of a detox issue, that the detox pathways have been So hormonal imbalance, yeah, these all. So almost all diseases are related, because they kind of overwhelm all the processes of the body. So
yeah, it's all about inflammation, right? And inflammation is a part of every disease state. So even heart disease, people come in with cholesterol abnormalities, thyroid abnormalities. All these things have something underlying them.
Yeah, that's so true. And inflammation is a double-edged sword. So some of these toxins would cause inflammation. And then if you have an inflammatory burden in the body, it would make it harder to get rid of that. It would almost occupy all the detox pathways. Well, the good news is when we treat it, so I personally have patients when they had, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is very common, and we check their antibodies and they're high usually. But just doing a little bit of detox work, just cleaning the diet, doing a little bit of gut health work, and the antibodies start coming down very, very easily.
Phenomenal. So we know toxins can turn certain genes on and off, and that's why we're big on the whole trying to beat your genetics, technically, right? So what are some diseases or conditions associated with toxin exposure and high levels of toxins?
Right. So there are, I think in this day and age, everyone should know it's so easy to do your genetics and then have a healthcare professional look at them and then see which genetic pathways are impacted. So it's all about the interaction of genes with the environment, right? So for example, when I did mine, I was blown away because I didn't know I have methylation issues. Like I have the MTHFR. I have 2 copies of it actually, and then I have COMT. So I was like, well, no wonder why if I have an argument or even if my kids talk about something little stimulating, then I just stay up all night because I'm not able to break down the neurotransmitters that are released after in an excited state. And then the methylation that affects almost all the detox processes. So it's not just one thing. It's like you look at how these. So I also have the CYP1 gene that affects coffee metabolism. Mm-hmm. So then I realized if I drink coffee in the afternoon, I won't be able to break it down. And then if you're overwhelming that gene with too much caffeine, then it would not be able to perform the other functions, other things it's supposed to break down. So it's so individualized that everyone should know their genes. They should know their environmental burden, and then look at what disease processes they're at risk for. But you would think of things like dementia, Parkinson's disease, all the autoimmune diseases, autism, these are any autoimmune disease, these are very, very directly linked to how our genes interact with the environment.
Like, and some examples of autoimmune conditions like lupus or Sjogren's, Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, right? And I know we've also seen this associated with just like mood disorders, right, or learning disabilities, that's why I think we're seeing even with children these days. I mean, think about what people don't realize is when you're pregnant as a female, your toxins are going to that child. And so some children are born with toxin overload without even being very exposed true to the environment yet.
So it's so good that you said that it's when these children are being born, what we are seeing is these children, the babies, the neonates, first of all, if you test their cord blood, the cord blood tests for like hundreds of toxins, but the lead levels in these children are many times higher than the mother. So it's almost like the body detoxed and pushed it all towards a child who's going to be so sensitive. How lead we know is so, toxic to the brain. How could you expose? So I think young people like you, hopefully me and Brian are not having any more babies, but young people should definitely be thinking about detoxing before they go on that path and, to try to plan a baby, because it takes time. It takes 1 to 2 years to really clean out your whole lifestyle and your body. So you're exactly right.
Absolutely.
Why are some people more affected than others?
That's a really, really good question. So that leads me to this bucket or sink theory that we talk about in the detox world. So let's just say, I give you an example that your bathroom tub is overflowing, So the water is now overflowing. So there are three different things involved. First, there's water coming in, right? So that's the inflow. And then there's the water, the drainage system. Something's blocked there, so it's not going out. And that's what's making the water flow. So it's less about the water in the tub. It's more about why are you not shutting the water? If I come to your house and I see you just mopping the floor, I'd be like, hey, why don't you shut off the water? So it's the same analogy that, the inflow is these toxins that are coming in. So it's the exposure that's happening. And the outflow, the drainage, is our drainage pathways or our detox pathways. So I think let's talk about first, to directly answer your question, why some people retain more toxins or why are some people more affected, is number one factor that they have seen in studies is the amount of processed diet. So if the people who are eating a highly processed diet would be more likely to retain the toxins and detox less, I think there's another factor, that inadequate protein intake. So I think if you're eating a highly processed diet, you would be more likely to have inadequate protein intake. So these are linked, but also protein intake is very important for adequate detox. Then there are nutrient deficiencies. And this, you probably check it. One of my basic tests that I do is a nutrient evaluation. And it is an epidemic. Everybody could use nutrient optimization. Like when I did mine, I on paper looked probably like a drug addict or an alcoholic. Everything, all the B vitamins, all the antioxidants were low. And now I know why. It was a low stomach acid from the stressful jobs we do. So that leads me to the intestinal health. Like if you have low stomach acid or enzymes, which is very common as we grow in 30s, 40s, it's just like the stomach acid and the enzymes start declining. So that leads to a poor detox. Intestinal dysbiosis or a poor microbiome, which is very, very common. Nobody has a perfect gut. Everybody could work on their gut. That leads to a poor detox. And then there are genetic SNPs. Like I know I have poor detox pathways. And the most people, when I test them, they have deficits in the detox pathways. And it's almost like our genes are on this collision path with the environment because they can't keep up. We have changed the environment so rapidly in the last few years or 100 years or so that the biology hasn't caught up yet. So the genes are struggling. But certain people, those are canaries in the coal mine, the people who get affected more. I would think that's a wake-up call for all of us because sooner or later it's going to be us. It's these people are like lighting the way for us. Like, hey, that's what's happening and that's coming your way. So because of the genetic SNPs. So in short answer would be highly processed diet, nutrient deficiencies, also stress and trauma, which I think stress is another toxin that we internally produce. But if you're in a highly activated or sympathetic dominant state, you're not going to be able to detox. The body is just
Absolutely. You're not able to heal.
Mm-hmm. And the dysbiosis. So so that's a short answer, but I do want to explain the sync theory. I don't know how we're doing on time.
Great. Just keep going. I'm enjoying this so much.
Thank you. Me too. So the sync theory is that, like we said, we in conventional medicine, I feel like for the first 20 years of my life in conventional medicine, we are just mopping the floor because these are the symptoms. When water is overflowing, then you have symptoms of autoimmune disease and cancer and thyroid disease. And then we are just mopping the floor, putting creams. If you have acne, I'm going to give you steroids. I'll give you these creams. That's, to me, is mopping the floor. We are not addressing the root cause. So addressing the root cause means stopping the exposure and then opening the drainage pathways. So then the sync becomes important after you've done that. So you stop the exposure. So if I have a patient I'm detoxing, I'll stop their exposure. I'll completely clean out their lifestyle, and we can talk more at length about it.
So in theory, you turn off the faucet.
Turn off the faucet, exactly. Then you open their drainage pathways. And there's a way to do it. It gets a little techy, but people these days, your listeners, I'm sure if they're listening to this podcast, they are, super aware and knowledgeable. The detox pathways are, we classify them as phase 1, phase 2, as phase 3. So phase 3 is your elimination pathways, how you're eliminating through your colon, through urine, through skin. So when we sweat, When we have a bowel movement, when we urinate, we are eliminating things.
I want to interrupt there a little bit. And I think that this is exactly why people don't realize how important it is to poop. Okay. I mean, I talk about it every day with people, and I want them to understand this is a natural way for your body to detox every single day. And if you're not pooping, those toxins are staying right in your gut.
Exactly. That's why we open those pathways before you would do any other detox, because otherwise you're just like, so then you go. So we usually ask for like having at least 2 bowel movements a day, and adequate hydration, that you're drinking every hour, you're drinking a significant amount of water, and you should be, going to the bathroom pretty often to urinate. The skin, the sweating is so important, that sauna or any way that you can sweat, they have tested the heavy metals in the sweat are at a much higher concentration than inside. So we know we are eliminating them when we sweat. Infrared saunas, they work with a different mechanism, so they're not a substitution for each other. And with one, you're eliminating, and infrared saunas work through bioresonance. So they actually knock off these toxins directly off wherever they're attached. So that's your phase 3. Then we address phase 2. Phase 1 and phase 2 are both happening in the liver. When these toxins are presented to the liver try to make them excretable through different processes like oxidation, these. So they then become more active, and they're like actually their worst form, and you should not be having them freely in your body, because they'll cause more damage than their parent forms. So that's why we work on the phase 2 pathways, which work on conjugating these activated forms and getting rid of them. And the phase 2 pathways include things like glucuronidation, methylation, sulfation. And that's where people's adequate individual capacity, I know I have methylation is another one of the methylation deficits. You may have like a sulfation deficit, which we'll be able to see in your genes. And then we see, okay, how do we support that pathway? So when their liver has done the job of making these active metabolites of toxins, then they can bind them. It's almost like the liver's like attaching like a Velcro to these toxins. And now you got to bind them with using methylation, sulfation, glucuronidation. There's some others, and then you get rid of them. So then after the phase 3, which is bowel and bladder, we work on phase 2, which is your methylation, sulfation. And once you know that those pathways are adequately supported, then you work on activating the phase 1 pathway in the liver, so you go to the cell last. You kind of keep opening all the downstream pathways, because it goes from the cell down to the interstitial space, down to the liver, then to the bile, then to the GI tract. And that's when it's eliminated, either through the kidney or the gut. So you start working from below, and then you go up high to the cellular level.
Perfect. I mean, as you said, if they're not having bowel movements, then it's just sitting there still.
So this is a really great thing you said that, but there is a downside to this, because what do you see as influencers on YouTube and all? They would have many million of followers, much more than me and you guys. But what are they talking about? Hey, there's this detox cleanse you should try. There's this juice you should try. And and people buy into it. I have my friends, they're like physicians. They're like, I'm going to do this detox juice cleanse. I'm like, so you're putting sugar in your body? You think you're detoxing? So they are mostly talking about elimination. That's the
only thing they're talking about.
That's the only thing they're talking about.
And it's temporary.
It's temporary. So that's why most people feel a little better, but then they get worse. And also it's just eliminating what's already there. It's not really working on upstream, like actual cellular detoxification.
And just for our listeners, the methylation and the other phase 2 keys that you mentioned, I mean, that has a lot to do with your genetics. And we know, like, I also am a compound heterozygous MTHFR.
Oh,
and so, and so I take, supplements to help my body methylate, to allow it to function at 100% versus like 60%. And, that allows us to detox.
So me and you, without Brian, we'll do another podcast on just methylation. It's my favorite topic, because you could do so much. So do you know, that when we address methylation, so we can reverse our age, like our biological age is all about DNA methylation. So I was part of this study actually when Cara Fitzgerald, she's just a genius naturopathic doctor, but she did this study where she studied DNA methylation pattern. And then she improved methylation. And then she studied the DNA methylation pattern. So DNA methylation is your biological age. So she studied biological age. Then she improved through mostly lifestyle. There was nothing artificial, mostly lifestyle methods to improve methylation. And then she studied their biological age again. It was an 8-week study. So just guess how much their age was reversed in 8 weeks.
I'm going to guess 10 years.
Okay, 3.
Oh,
but still,
I was too hopeful.
Yeah, well, still, if you keep doing it, to reverse your age 3 years in 8 weeks,
it's amazing.
I think it's amazing.
That is.
And I did that study, so I lived that lifestyle, and I've done it again. She runs through it, and it's simple lifestyle things: clean eating, lots of colorful veggies. You do this breath work or some sort of a grounding work in the morning and evening. Exercise just 30 minutes. That's pretty much it. Like it's you do natural methylating adaptogens, which I'm sure there's so many, like rosemary. There are things like that are just in nature.
Yeah, I love it. And so definitely we will have you back to discuss that. I would love that topic.
Methylation is my favorite topic.
Well, we believe that everybody should know their genetics. And the great thing about genetics is you only need to do it once. It's not going to change.
Right.
So once you know it and have that paper, you can always come back and refer to it. So how do you test for toxins?
Right. So that, I think, first of all, that people, when you get to that level, people should be working with a healthcare provider. Because I have had many patients come in who have spent like thousands of dollars on do this, they test their hair and nail, whatever, for analysis. And now they're confused with the results they're coming back. And I'm like, you could have saved all this money. So the testing for toxin is fairly nuanced, because there's no one test for all the toxins. So I think, like you said, Brian, I would start with testing the genetics, because then you have an idea of where their SNPs are. So what they're at risk for, what their symptoms are telling us. Then I would guide the testing. So, for example, I would give you an example. Mercury is often used as this metaphor for toxins because, you could pretty much say that how the mercury poisoning happens. Like if you're dealing with that adequately, you're kind of dealing with all the toxin pathways. So when we test so I had this patient who came to me and she just had symptoms everywhere. She was very anxious. She couldn't focus. She was highly sensitive to foods and different things. I wasn't even testing for toxins, but I do this test called NutriVal by Genova. They test all the micronutrients. Such a good under the hood test, like kind of looking at your whole body and like lifting up the hood. And before I knew about the test, like the health department called her and said, hey, is someone trying to poison you? Because your mercury level is through the roof. And they tested in blood. So all she was doing is just eating a lot of fish to be healthy. She would eat fish and like other meat. The only meat she would eat is fish. I'm like, hey, that's what's doing it. So we did test, that screening test was in the blood. But blood usually only has acute exposure. So if someone's really acutely exposed to something, it's going to show up in the blood for a little bit because the toxins are stored in bones, in the brain, and in adipose tissue. So unfortunately, there's not a great way to test those spaces, right? I'm not going to have a brain biopsy or my fat biopsy to test. So the best that we have as a tissue sample is urine, where you'll also see it in the urine once you're getting rid of it. That's why most people like to do a provoked urine. So you provoke it with the DMSA or EDTA, and then so first you do a sample after overnight in the morning, and then you provoke it. And then if you see a much higher concentration, then there's toxic burden in the body that the body's trying to get rid of. And so you can test it in the urine. Now, in the tissues, some people would say, like hair testing or nail testing. What I would tell you is, like me, in this group of 3 people, 2 people have methylation deficits, me and Deanna. I don't know, maybe you, okay,
no,
great. Oh my God, awesome. So so depositing toxins in the hair and all is like a luxury for the body. So only if the methylation is working adequately, then you would be able to put it in the hair. So like you may not be able to see anything in my hair, and that may just be because I'm a poor methylator. So,
Interesting.
Yeah, I just learned it at the recent conference, so that was really interesting. So I think for most people, it's testing in urine, and then there are some other ways, like some people are negative and then you're strongly suspecting it, then you could do as much as like a muscle testing or a biopsy, and then they test positive. But I think between the blood and the urine, and the SNPs, knowing the SNPs, we have a good milieu or a whole picture.
Okay, that's fabulous. It sounds like you get a lot of detail there. And, something we didn't mention before is like some other exposures of, like you mentioned, mercury. You can get it from your diet if you're mostly like pescatarian. And certain fish obviously have more mercury than others. And also like even gadolinium that you get when you're doing imaging, like CT scan or MRIs, right? And even pharmaceuticals have it. And we talked about people, actually, we talked about this previously on another podcast, that a lot of cancer treatments out there are toxic because they have to kill the cancer. But then you still could have some remnants of that after you are in remission. And so that's another type of patient that I do always recommend to have heavy metal testing as well. And here we are talking about heavy metals, but there's also mold testing, right? And you can be exposed to mold. I mean, we live in Florida, so it's probably everywhere with the moisture and everything. So there's different testing for mold. So like you said, it's not all encompassing. Sometimes, unfortunately, this does add up, but you have to decide, is this worth the investment into your health?
Right. So every second home in the U.S. is water damaged. So imagine how many of those homes are in Florida.
Right.
And then, it's a hugely under-recognized problem because we didn't know. Because people are like, my grandma always lived in a moldy basement. If nothing happened to her, why should I worry? Well, you should worry because the living spaces are different now. They're getting more and more cramped. And the EMF that we didn't touch upon, like it's not a recognized toxin, but EMF makes everything worse. So EMF actually agitates the mold. So the mold is like more active and more, it's like you're making the mold angry. And which house now does not have Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
I will tell you, I would love to have another podcast on that because I've been doing a lot of research on EMF and blocking it and whatnot. So we will definitely come back to that another time. So why don't we go ahead and discuss your treatment plan? I know you touched on your sink or bathtub method, and that had a little bit in it. But why don't you elaborate a little more, like your initial plan and lifestyle changes that people can do?
Another whole podcast or series of podcasts. But what I would do. So we talked about the sink, but what I wanted to emphasize is when you're looking at a person, every one of us would have an individual sink, right? Like, just like your bathtub or your kitchen sink, some is flat or narrow or deep. So every one of us have this capacity or a bucket, which is determined by our genetics and our individual circumstances, what we've been exposed to growing up, and, how we are dealing with life. So how much are we able to detox? So it's the size of that sink is what matters. And when that capacity reaches its threshold, that's when you start overflowing and have symptoms. So when I'm seeing someone, like my goal would be to determine the size of their bucket or their capacity. So like Brian said, knowing the genetics is a primal foundational step, and then doing a really, really good history, and then seeing what further testing we should do. Knowing that sometimes if they're not detoxing, if they're living a dirty lifestyle and I just know their detox pathways are blocked, I may delay testing. There are some patients I have that are begging for, when are we going to do the test? How are we? I'm like, you may not be detoxing right now and your test may be negative. Like these are the mold patients I have. Then what would you do? How would it help? So I would rather work on, minimizing the exposure, at the same time working on opening their detox pathways before I do a test. I just attended the ISCAI, that's International Society of Environmentally Acquired Illness. Their whole topic this year for yearly conference was mold. So they came to this conclusion that there is not a one test or one thing we can say that this is the test. That's not how, this world of integrative medicine and all. personalized medicine is never about one thing. So you have to look at the whole milieu, their whole history, their whole timeline. How were they born? What kind of toxins they might have been exposed to if they grew up in a farm, or, what they grew up eating processed food. Were they even breastfed or not? All these things, little things matter. And I use all of that to assess and then determine when and if the testing is appropriate. But I think that gets so individualized. Then you use different approaches. So it depends on what the root cause is, where they're deficient, which pathway I need to support. But I think there are certain simple things that probably account for 50-60% of all treatment plans that any of us, we can walk away with them. Your listeners can start instituting them today. So I think that's what we should focus on.
I think you hit upon a key point, a key difference between integrative and functional medicine and traditional medicine, in that it has to be individualized. Right. In the past, if you had blood pressure, everybody started you on the same 3 or 4 medicines. If you had high cholesterol, everybody started you on the same 3 or 4 medicines. You did the same exact testing. In this world, it's completely different. Everybody has to have different individualized testing, and everybody has to have a different treatment protocol. You can't go to your friend and say, hey, this worked for me, it'll work for you, because it probably won't.
Right. That's a very good way of how one of my friends explained it, and that made peace. Is because I was like, why does the conventional model not working for me personally? Is because we're dealing with the population-based care, how we were treated, or how the insurance companies are they're managing masses, like population at large. So in that model, you can only barely scratch the surface, and you can do disease management. We're very good at disease management. We're the best in the world. Disease management in the hospital, outside. But what me and you are looking for is health optimization and getting to the root cause and reversing disease.
And that's going to be the future of medicine.
It's so exciting. I think it's here now, the future, that we can reverse disease. We don't have to deal with symptoms anymore.
And prevent.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
So in this podcast, we just scratched the surface. I think there's way more that we need to discuss, and then later on break it down a little bit more. But if patients wanted to get a hold of you, or if they wanted to contact you, how can they do that?
So my website, that's going to be active. I'm actually this week or next, it's humaalimd.com.
And that's
HUMAALIMD.com. And then the email would be info@humaalimd.com. So any of these, I used to give people my cell number, but then someone said, don't do that, because it's like a small practice. That's what we do. We can't, I just take pride in dealing with a small number of patients and knowing them really deeply and really well. But this is the way for us to reach out to the masses, where not everybody may be able to come to me or, afford a personalized care, but there are things that they can incorporate, which we didn't touch upon. I have a whole list of resources and all, but
I love it. We'll definitely have to have you back, Dr. Huma, and I will have how people can reach out to you in our show notes.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on. The information contained in this podcast is provided for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended for the purposes of diagnosing, curing, treating, or preventing any disease. This podcast is provided on the understanding that it does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Before using any products or services referenced on this podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, carefully read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information found or received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem, or should you have any healthcare questions, please promptly call or see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Dr. Brian Marias, Deanna Weilbacher, and Hybrid Medical Solution, do not claim responsibility for any adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for any statements made by the guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referenced.
If you would like to submit any questions or if you have any topics you would be interested in hearing about on future episodes, please contact us through our website, www.hybridmedicalsolution.com. That is solution with no S at the end. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, all under Hybrid Medical Solution.